Hi, and welcome to Faith, Hope, and Love During an Election. I'm so delighted today to have my friend Maurice Possley talking with us and sharing his expertise, his convictions, his ideas, and what matters to him in this upcoming election. So, Maurice, if you want to introduce yourself and say what you're doing, what you're working on, and even something about how your work looks different if it does since the start of the pandemic.
Well, thanks, Jen, for asking me to participate. I'm happy to do so. I am currently the senior researcher for the National Registry of Exonerations. This is a 3-university research project, Michigan and Michigan State Law Schools, and the University of California, Irvine, Newkirk Center for Science and Society. And it is an online database of wrongful convictions from 1989, which was the year of the first DNA exoneration, to present. We currently we're moving in on 2,700 cases of people who were convicted of crimes they didn't commit, and in some cases convicted of crimes that never happened. It wasn't a crime. Before that, I was a journalist I still consider myself a journalist, but spent 25 years at the Chicago Tribune writing a lot about criminal justice, but was a journalist for more than 30 years. I'm a writer. I've written some nonfiction books, some about true crime. My focus is on the criminal justice system, its fairness, what causes people to get wrongly convicted, and by creating this database and tracking causes of wrongful conviction, we can provide data for researchers, policymakers, legislators that can be used to fashion fixes, legislation, administrative changes to prevent people who are innocent from being wrongly convicted. And the other side of that is, certainly in the cases where crimes occurred, to get the right person who we know from our research and from the research of others, that someone who gets away with it because someone is wrongfully convicted doesn't necessarily, and usually doesn't, say, aha, I better stop now because
Right.
I lucked out on that one. No, they usually go on and continue to commit more crimes. So that's really my work is I do it remotely, and so I continue to do it remotely. I live in Southern California, and so we have, it's a great place if you're going to be cloistered during a pandemic.
View of the ocean.
We can see the ocean, watch the boats, walk the dog almost every day without any fear of weather. So I'm not.
Unlike when you lived in my neck of the woods.
Right. And I don't miss mosquitoes, let me tell you that. So.
Mm-hmm. Well, you're also very modest, because it was, 2008 when you won the Pulitzer for investigative reporting, and you've been a finalist for that award a number of times. And people can find you at mauricepossley.com, which we'll put a link up as well if they want to look into your books and other work that you do.
Well, thank you.
I'd love to hear about your own development as a person. If you want to start with your family of origin and how you were raised to think about being a citizen and how to be civically engaged. Did that come from your home, or what were the sort of milestones in your life that kind of moved you to where you are in terms of your convictions?
I was the oldest of 7 and raised in a very small town. Well, it's all relative, but about 1,300 people in Western Illinois. My mother was a school teacher and my father was a cheesemaker. As in, blessed are the cheesemakers.
I refrain from doing it. I've said that to you how many times?
I was raised a Roman Catholic, and not only that, was raised across the street, about 150 feet away from the church. And so our family was, and we were a mission. In other words, the priest resided in another parish about 10 miles away and went back and forth. So we shared a priest, but we were not the home base. And so our family and a few other families, my grandmother particularly, my dad's mother, were very involved in not just matters of faith, but in physical upkeep and making sure that the church was, viable in a lot of different ways. And so, I went that sort of route that you might expect. I was an altar boy. I went to Catholic high school. I would say that I sometimes call myself a collapsed Catholic. Rather than I went to Loyola University, where the Jesuits make sure you get an education, whether you like it or not. But I would say along the way, I had that issue, and then later in life, sort of had the classic, I came back to God. I found God again. In terms of how we were raised to be good people, to be kind, to be responsible, that if you said you were going to do something, you did it. I think both my parents came from those kind of backgrounds where they both came from very large families, and I think where children were always interactive with each other, and you had to learn to be a good citizen to get along. And there was a lot of love in all these households, but I think that there was I say it's an ethic that I got from, and I think all of us got from our parents, which was really first, work hard. Second, be kind, and be honest, and that treat other people, the classic kind of golden rule, that goes a long way. And so I'd say in my lifetime, I just turned 70. I've sort of recognized those are things that really sustain me, and have shaped how I sort of view the world, in terms of issues of fairness and justice. And I was drawn as a journalist early on to covering the legal system. I even toyed with the idea of going to law school, and then realized that I really liked the observer rather than the person who. And it was through covering trials and covering the justice system that really opened my eyes to a world that I was sort of unaware of. And by that, I mean, I think I was raised sort of like a lot of people are raised, especially people of what I would call privilege, that the system is fair, that it treats everybody the same, and that the good guys are always are on the prosecution, the police, on that side, and they don't do any wrong. And it was as a journalist that I really had a few epiphanies about that, in terms of not only the fairness of the justice system, but what it does in terms of, well, let me back up and say, I've sort of concluded that there was a period of time where we decided that we were going to let the justice system solve our social problems in this country. And so we dumped just about anything that could be adjudicated in a court of law into the court system. And so, 25 years later or 30 years later, what are we looking at? One of the highest incarceration rates in the world. And that solved nothing, really, in my opinion. I can keep going on. I mean, I will say this. One of my first real epiphanies of the criminal justice system was in 1983 when one of my roommates from college, who had gone on to become a lawyer, was representing a woman in a divorce case in Chicago, and her husband, who was a police officer, Chicago police officer, brought a gun to court and shot and killed the judge and shot and killed my friend. And it wasn't long after that, and sort of working through that grief, that I had to decide whether or not I believed that this person should be killed for what he did. And it was and that was even before the trial, that I realized that it would do me no good, and that it would sort of fly in the face of the way I was raised. Although we didn't talk about this, being raised. It was just not an issue that came up of whether or not, we should kill people to show other people that they shouldn't kill people, or whether the state should be responsible for taking people's lives. And it was really at that point in time that I had this sort of a conclusion that, as far as I can, and I really couldn't voice it because I was a journalist and I was covering the criminal justice system. It was a personal opinion. I had to be objective, but I realized that I basically concluded that only God should be in charge of taking lives and not the state. And then the more I covered the system, I realized how wrong it could be.
And it can be, yeah.
And how unfairly a lot of people wind up getting treated. And so while you might say, well, we have the best criminal justice system in the world, that's a relative statement in a lot of ways. And it may be, but it still is not. It's a human system. And you get in there and you realize that just because someone says something doesn't mean it's true. And it's hard to not become a hardened cynic about it. I do believe that, for instance, that I think police have one of the hardest jobs in the country. But they're humans just like us, and they make mistakes. And the system grinds people down. They see the worst of the worst. And it's hard to remain dispassionate sometimes about it. But you see that people have some of the same goals that we all do, which are, we want to succeed. We want to be a success. We want to be valued for what we do. If you're a prosecutor and you go in for your annual review and you've had 6 jury trials and 3 people were acquitted and 3 people were convicted, typically the supervisor is going to say, well, you only did about half the job. Because, face it, everybody thinks that the person by the time they get there must have been the person who did it. So we have this system that is based on successes, wins and losses, and we tend to lose sight of what the real goal is, which is, let's do justice. And having spent the last 8 years solely working, just the registry came into existence in 2012, and having now written about, we have 2,650 odd cases now, and having written about 17 or 1,800 of those stories, you think that they would get boring, but each one is its own separate tragedy with its own set of victims on both sides of the equation. These are all people who were falsely convicted of a crime that they did not commit. And so And these are ones that we know about. And we really have no idea how many people were wrongfully convicted and were never exonerated or never will be exonerated and are sitting in prisons today. People that, and we actually have a feature on our website that lists the longest incarcerations between the time of conviction and the time of exoneration. And the current leader, if you will, spent 45 years and 2 months in prison. And I've talked to a lot of these people. And one of the things that I just find incredibly remarkable is how intact they emerge, how intact they are when they emerge, whether it's 25 years or 10 years or 40 years or 30 years. We have a list, and it's about 100, it's more than 150 people that spent more than 25 years. And that's not to say that everyone does, but the vast majority do. And when you talk to these people, almost invariably the answer is they found some kind of faith, whatever flavor they got attached to, and it helped them figure out a way to, it's hard enough to do it when you've committed the crime. But people figure out a way to put one foot in front of another when you don't know if you'll ever get out, and in fact, that you're innocent, that you did not do the crime. It's a tremendous thing to have to deal with. But people do. I remember
you. I think maybe when you were at about 1,000 in the registry, we talked about some of the cases that you had been writing about, and you said to me how remarkable it was that people come out and you would imagine these like brittle, hollow, resentful, vengeful people, but that you were meeting, you said almost without exception, people who had such wisdom and such grace and such the ability to move on from it. And as you say, it being intact, it is amazing. And it's not at all what I would assume. I would think if I had been in jail or in prison for 25 years for something I knew I didn't do, I don't know. I hope I wouldn't shrivel up inside, but I feel like, yeah, the amount of their resilience and their spirit, it must be very moving for you to keep hearing these stories. How do you keep your heart open in this when you're bearing such witness to all this brokenness?
I think for me, well, first of all, sometimes it just helps to have a good cry. But for me, being able to write the stories, I've always believed, having been a journalist for 50 years, essentially, that sunshine is a great cure. And to be able to write every one of these stories and to write it in a way that it's a truth-telling sort of exercise that has, in a manner of speaking, everyone has a happy ending because they get exonerated. Now, you see some that come out and they wind up back in the same milieu where they were before, and they wind up getting in trouble again, or incredibly, a lot of them die within a few years because I think the stress and strain of it's not exactly a healthy environment. And even though they come out relatively intact, they come out with health problems. It's not the best health system in the world in a penitentiary. They wind up in car accidents, construction accidents. It's really sort of tragic. But the arc really is, you start with a tragedy that happens to someone or some people. They're the victims of a crime. And then the next person that's victimized is the person who's wrongly accused. And you follow that arc going through the trial and then being convicted and then being sentenced. And you talk about people that come out intact. When you think about people who are sentenced to death, which that has an outcome certain, supposedly, or life without parole, which is, you die there. They're both death sentences. It's just the manner of the execution is different. And you talk to people who say, I never lost hope. Hope was the one thing that I felt that I had that they couldn't take away from me. And having something that no one else can take away. When we convict someone and send them to prison, we basically take away everything they had. And for people on death row or life without parole, everything that they possibly might want or could be, we take away that. And the ones who really survive are, you see these innocent people who are surviving, and it's because they say, I could not give up hope. I talked to one fellow who was actually from Chicago, who after 25 years, and I said, so you found God? And he said, no, I went back to God. He said, I was raised, my grandmother made us go to church. And then he said, in my teens, I fell away and I got into trouble. And he wound up being falsely accused of a murder, convicted of a murder, and sentenced to life without parole. And he said, for the first 3 years, all I did was fight. I fought the guards, I fought the inmates, I fought everyone because I was so angry. And he said, finally, after one bout in solitary assignment or solitary confinement, because I'd been fighting, an older inmate gave him a Bible and said, maybe you ought to start reading this. And he said it basically helped me, it changed my life to help me figure out how to maneuver through this with the idea that someday the truth would emerge. And it took 25 years, but it did emerge. So those stories are uplifting in sort of a strange way, in the sense that there's so much tragedy, but out of that, these people remained hopeful, were resilient. It's very sad when they said, I lost my mother, I lost my grandparents, I lost my siblings, everyone I knew basically turned away from me. I had one guy said no one came to visit him because they thought I did it, he said. And so when your own family, that's really tough. But, the idea of keeping that hope and keeping some faith that they will be sort of delivered from this situation is very uplifting and very remarkable. And by telling all these stories, one of the things that we hope to do is shed light on and provide a body of work, a body of evidence to evoke change, that people can rely upon us to evoke change, because no one can say, well, you cherry picked a few egregious examples to try to make your case. No, we have more than 2,500 cases, people who were convicted of even things like drunk driving or misdemeanor batteries, to people who are convicted of horrible, horrible crimes. But the thing they have in common is that they didn't do it.
What are some of the changes that you hope this body of evidence could make?
I think the system needs to be as open as possible, and that the culture needs to be changed from that of us and them, winning and losing, to let's try to find justice that's appropriate for the right person and for the situation. I think we definitely see a trend away from the death penalty in this country, because I think whether you buy it as it's too expensive, or we can't be confident that we'll convict the guilty people, or we shouldn't be in the business of deciding who lives and who dies, but that's not something for the state. Whatever your reasons are, and there's a combination of these factors that have played out in states. Colorado abolished the death penalty earlier in 2020. The I think that by trying to adopt measures such as everything that's in the prosecution's hands should be shown to the defense. Nothing should be held back. Um, there is a problem in this country with prosecutors who think this is the guy, and so I'm going to get this conviction. And if there's evidence that points to someone else, it's a red herring. Something that is being gradually adopted in this country is the recording of interrogations by police. What goes on in an interrogation room? Now we've gone, I think we've gone through periods. We had the torture cases in Chicago where detectives were torturing confessions out of people. But I think that we have cases of young people who are coerced to confess to crimes they didn't commit, and witnesses being coerced to implicate people and say things that weren't true because of fear of being locked up themselves. The more transparent you can make the system, the more accountable it can be, and I think that it will reduce it. We can't stop people from lying. We can't stop people from falsely accusing other people of, I saw him, I was angry at him and I saw him and I said, I'm going to say that he's the one that stole that, or he's the one that attacked me, or because they're angry. But if we have a system that is, when they do, before physicians perform surgery, everybody gets together and they say, okay, are we all in agreement here that what we're going to do is operate on the right leg, not the left leg, not the left arm, but we're, and I don't know that happens often enough. Is the person that we're putting in the dock today, are we all 100% sure that this is the person? I mean, face it, I do think they get the right person most of the time. It's just that when you start to think that you get it most of the time, you start to think that you get it all the time.
Right.
And so there are things such as having actual defense bar qualifications for people who, if you're going to have the death penalty or a capital case, or if you're going to have something where the potential sentence is life without parole the rest of their life, that they ought to have certain qualifications and have certain experience before they can go in and start defending. Because you see these tragic cases of families that don't have a whole lot of money and they can scrape together $5,000, and for $5,000 in a murder case, maybe you get, a friend of the family who he's done a few, DUIs and real estate closings, and now he's doing a capital murder trial. It's just insane. I think that forensic science has improved in a way that a lot of junk science that used to be readily accepted is not, although there's still battles over it. But I think that that's a profession that is worked hard. I think that it would be much better if crime labs were independent and not part of police departments. I think that they tend to start to fall into the mindset of, we're an arm of the police and we're helping them get the bad guy, as opposed to, let's analyze this evidence and decide whether or not what it means. Whether it implicates anyone or else is a separate question. Just what does it mean? What does it tell us? Whether it's DNA testing or some of the old stuff like bite marks and hair analysis that were very unreliable. But you see things now like analyzing cell phone records and locating people by what pinged off towers. And there's a lot more of the electronic sort of digital stuff that's coming in. And some of it's reliable and some of it is, it's used in a manipulated way. I just wrote up a case out of Detroit where it was a guy who was a landlord of a building, and it was under rehab. And someone broke in to steal copper, two guys, and there was a security guard for the building, and one of these guys wound up getting shot and killed. And it turned out to be the security guard, but they prosecuted the owner, the landlord, even though cell phone records showed that he was on an expressway at the time of the crime. And they got around that by getting people to lie by saying, well, when I called him, a woman answered, and, you know, trying to put the cell phone in someone else's. And it was just purely manipulated because they were convinced that he was the person who had done this shooting, and were able to get around what you would think would be pretty scientific evidence by getting someone to lie. So eyewitness identification techniques have been improved a lot, and I think we know what can be adopted to better improve our eyewitness identifications. There's a much more of an acknowledgement now that memory is not like a video camera. We can't just play it back in our minds. It doesn't just record everything, particularly if you're in a situation where someone's waving a knife or a gun or some sort of weapon. And you can go through our cases and say, well, out of 2,650 cases, X number of people were convicted because of a mistaken witness identification, because of official misconduct, of failure of witness intimidation, or failure to disclose evidence, or an inadequate legal defense, or we have these 6 factors. And you can use them and look at some of these cases to say, well, we don't have a problem. And you look at it and say, well, maybe we do have a problem. And one of the things that I think has really been a positive development in the criminal justice system is the district attorney's office establishing conviction integrity units. And these are independent, so-called independent units within these offices that actually entertain claims of wrongful conviction and investigate them. And some of them have been really good. Chicago, New York, Brooklyn particularly, Dallas, Michigan, Detroit, Michigan, Wayne County have been, and now Philadelphia, have been really, really aggressive and open to claims of wrongful conviction and believing some of these when the evidence takes them that way. So there are times when I'm really down, and there are times when I'm really positive. I mean, one of the things that does concern me is in the country is the idea that the rule of law, which is basically no one's above the law, seems to be ignored and just sort of discarded in some instances. And it's really coming from the top down. And what I think that does is it sends a message. And I think we've seen a communication of a message of, I wouldn't say just intolerance, but almost of revenge and hate and a lack of just pure human kindness. And that's very discouraging to me. It seems like it's going to take more than laws and legislation. It's going to take a shift in attitudes and a shift in how we perceive, and that has to come from the top, and it has to come across, and it has to sort of be, well, we're not going to tolerate this. That sort of behavior is intolerable. It's been very sort of depressing to me to see the support for sort of this politics of anger and revenge and isolationism, and that has evolved in how many people that, I mean, they drank the Kool-Aid. I mean, not to use an old term, but I don't get it. I don't understand how this happened. That's these people that are responsible, that 6 years ago, if you'd ask them a question, they wouldn't have answered it the same way they do now. And is it political expediency? Is it that they no longer have to cloak what their true beings were, to sort of portray a sense of decency?
Right.
I don't know. It's just, that's the part. And so I feel like I just need to, for my part, I have an individual role as a human being to do what I can to express what I think are the appropriate values and how to treat other people. And then through my professional work, it's to provide, through the stories of these people and the concrete data that underlies it, evidence that people can use to hopefully evoke change.
Mm-hmm. And I love the way you stated that, and I also love that ties in exactly to where we began with you talking about the values that your family imparted to you, and to be kind, to be fair, to be honest, and that's how you're living your life, and that's how you would love to reimagine our country. I'm sure that would be more fair, more kind, more honest.
And to be back where I think maybe we took things for granted in a way, but we did have an expectation that when we walked into stores or when we walked certain places, that it's sort of like driving a car is built on a system of trust, because you're trusting everyone else to not cross the center line, to and sort of living life. It requires trust in other people that we interact with, and I see sort of such a loss of that trust. And you say, well, how did this happen? And I think a lot of it is this. It even though that it happens subconsciously, where it's communicated in this way, that suddenly this is the right thing to do. The right thing to do is to put children in cages and separate people from their families, and to treat people like this, and to sort of, in a way, I feel like the atmosphere has been to free up people to feel like they can now do stuff. Every day you see a photo of, or a video of, I try not to do too much doom scrolling, although it's inevitable, but there's one about a woman who had just had a kidney transplant and was using a cane, and she was at an ATM machine, and a woman came up behind her, and the woman at the machine told the woman to put her mask on. And the woman threw her to the floor, broke her leg. It's like, where's all this anger and resentment? And there's always been a certain, part of our population that you have to be careful of. But I mean, it seems like it could be almost anyone. And you look at people and they where did this come from? And so, I mean, that's one of my biggest prayers, is that we can figure out as a people how to get each other's trust, get each other's respect.
Be decent to each other.
Yeah.
I don't think it'll happen overnight, and it's not, I mean, it's for all of us to participate in, but it will be refreshing not to have that constant barrage if indeed he doesn't win again, which, we don't know the answer to that at this point.
I don't think we'll know the answer until we know the answer. We thought we knew the answer the last time, and we were pretty wrong. And I still can feel exactly where, how I felt and where I was.
Yeah.
as that was unfolding that night. Um, the idea seems to have spread that certain things are not just unacceptable, that that it's okay, that
Mhm.
these are acceptable things to do, um, and ranging from just pure acts of just small acts of unkindness to just pure acts of viciousness, racism, and just sort of zealous language and physical acts that seem to be fall under it's tolerated behavior.
Mhm.
And I think some of that comes from if you say things enough over a period of time, suddenly people just they get inculcated with it, and they it it gradually what values there were start to slip away,
Mhm.
and you snap with a moment of anger at something, and then that passes, and then it happens again, and you start to look at people in a certain way and say, well, those are not the kind of people that I want in my country or want in my neighborhood, or and they say it out loud.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
I have great faith in this nation as a country to survive. I would say that, maybe every generation or so has their dark times,
Mhm.
um, fearful times, where I remember thinking that if Ronald Reagan were elected, I was probably going to have to move to Canada, and that didn't happen. He got elected. That didn't happen, and it wasn't that bad. It certainly isn't as bad as what I would say it is now. Um, but I have faith that people have galvanized, um, and care, um, move in the way that their conscience directs them, that we will survive all of this and get past it. It's been very painful, and it's been very painful I mean, as a Christian, to look and see what people who say they're people of faith have said, and have moved in this country, and that's been very discouraging. And I sort of feel like these are wayward sheep that need to be sort of brought back in some way. We'll see.
Mhm. Mm. Well, thank you so much for this conversation today. Before we end, I want to give you the chance to to direct people to your work, the National Registry of Exonerations. Um, for the video portion of this interview, we can put the URL up, but why don't you say it for people who are listening on a podcast?
Well, to find it, it's very easy. Just Google National Registry of Exoneration. It pops right up. You can even misspell a couple of those words, but it'll pop right up. Um, and it's as I said, a project of Michigan and Michigan State Law Schools and the University of California, Irvine. So any kind of combination of those, you'll find it. We're the only animal of its kind. There is no other collection like what this is, and it was sort of the brainchild of Rob Warden at Northwestern and Sam Gross at Michigan, to do this with no idea whether it would be sustained, whether it would sustain itself. And in fact, the good news is exonerations is a growth industry. The bad news is it's a growth industry.
Right, right.
um, so we always say we only know the ones we know about. We're constantly finding out about cases of exoneration that happened in the past. And so what you see on there is a basement figure. It's the bottom figure of the number of people wrongfully convicted, and each one is its own separate story of sort of tragedy and success in a way. And so I urge people to, it's sortable by state, county, all those things. You can find out what's going on in your neighborhood.
Yeah, which is important. And another thing that we've been talking about in this series is the importance of being a local person somewhere. Where are you a local, and how can you affect change in a local way? You know, we're not just all waiting for a presidential election. You know, we can be involved where we are and be informed. So I encourage everybody um, to look up the National Registry of Exonerations.
Well, thank you.
And I hope so too. Well, Maury, it's been really great to talk with you.
It's always good to connect with you, Jen.
Yeah, thanks.
All right. See ya.
Bye.
Bye.